My name is Jeffrey Michaels, and I'm the IEN Senior Fellow at eBay. I'd like to welcome all of you to eBay's seminar series on U.S. foreign policy. The series is part of a joint initiative of eBay and the Barcelona Institute of North American Studies that aims to promote a discussion of U.S. foreign policy related topics by inviting both scholars and practitioners to share their research and provide their insights. This evening, it gives me enormous pleasure to welcome Sara Moller. Please forgive me for my pronunciation. Who's an assistant professor at the School of Diplomacy and International Relations at Seton Hall University in the great state of New Jersey. She will be presenting on the topic of U.S.-NATO relations with a talk entitled Fair Winds and Following Seas, American Perspectives on NATO 1989 to 2022. But when I originally asked Sara to speak, this was back in January, I think. And then I thought, this topic would be extremely relevant, not for the least of reasons that with the NATO summit in Madrid coming up at the end of June, where they're supposed to be releasing a new strategic concept, that the NATO theme would be an interesting one to discuss. Unfortunately, I didn't realize quite how relevant this topic was going to be given all of the developments that have occurred since 24 February, although I think one can certainly go back even further than that. I was also keen to have this topic addressed as part of the seminar series because I think not only is there much less knowledge about NATO here relative to the European Union, but when I speak with many scholars and officials in Europe about NATO, I'm most surprised about how different the perspectives often are, especially when it comes to the future direction of the alliance and its priorities. So Sara will speak for about 25 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions. I was particularly grateful that Sara accepted this invitation because she's someone who seems to have her finger on the pulse of all things to do with NATO. And among other things, she also spent some time as an Eisenhower Defense Fellow at the NATO Defence College in Rome, and has also held several other relevant fellowships, including with the Security Studies program at MIT, the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, and the Modern War Institute at West Point. She's also published on a wide variety of themes associated with NATO, alliances, and coalitions. So I very much look forward to what she has to say. So Sara, welcome to eBay, virtually at least, and I look forward to your presentation, which should be loading up in just a moment.
Great. Thank you very much, Professor Michaels, both for inviting me and for that very kind introduction. My only regret is that I can't be there with you all at eBay in person, perhaps next time, since Barcelona is one of my all-time favorite cities. I want to begin by outlining what I propose to talk to you all about today. And I'm going to focus on the last 3 decades of U.S. foreign policy towards NATO. Slide, please. And I'm going to divide the post-Cold War period into 5 periods or eras. And for each, I'm going to explain briefly what developments occurred within NATO for that period, as well as the US administration's view and approach to those developments. And then I want to leave plenty of time for Q&A. But before I do so, I want to do 2 things. I want to briefly explain the title that I gave today's presentation. First, as Professor Michaels noted, I came up with that title, and indeed I received the invitation back in January, and came up with the title Fair Winds and Following Seas shortly thereafter. And I probably wouldn't have chosen that title if I had been asked more recently to come up with one. But Fair Winds and Following Seas, for those of you unaware, is a naval phrase which basically means good luck. It's a gesture of good luck. And the combination implies that a vessel should experience good winds and not have to pound into the waves, so to speak. I initially put a question mark in the title, but as you'll see shortly from my talk, I'm going to argue today that the overriding theme of post-Cold War US policy towards NATO has been continuity rather than change. That's not to say that there haven't been periods of, to continue on the naval theme, choppy waters, but there's a lot more continuity than change, I'm going to argue. All right, let's get started. So I'm going to briefly cover the Cold War period only because I want to highlight that a couple of themes that emerged in US policy towards NATO during the Cold War carried over into the post-Cold War period. So let's start with looking at US policy towards the Cold War. Slide, please. As you all know, the North Atlantic Treaty was signed in Washington on April 4th, 1949. We very recently, yesterday, celebrated NATO's 73rd birthday. There were originally 12 signatories. I won't name them, but you can look it up. It's worth noting that while it may, with the benefit of today's hindsight, seem obvious that the United States, the subject of today's talk, should belong to this post-war European security arrangement, it was not a foregone conclusion. In fact, NATO's origins lie in early post-war efforts by primarily Northern European countries like the Benelux countries, the UK and France, and you should ask yourself why those countries and what they have in common. The answer, of course, being that they were on the receiving end of German weapons in World War I and World War II. But it was those countries in the initial aftermath of World War II who were experimenting with the idea of a new security community, creating a new defensive league. They ultimately signed the Treaty of Brussels, and it was only later that the United States got involved. And it did so because, frankly, Europe was weak. More than 5 years of war had ravaged the economies, the societies, and the militaries of the European continent. And if this new post-war security experiment was going to have a chance at success, it needed the US at its center. But, and this is the first point I want to make this afternoon, Washington policy makers envisioned that the US commitment to European security would be temporary. No, they didn't think that they would be there for months, but they were hoping they would be there for years, more likely than decades. And the US participation in the North Atlantic Treaty was seen as an attempt by Washington to buy time so that European countries, which again had been ravaged by war, could regain their strength, and so that they would be able to deter on their own and, if necessary, defend against the Soviet Union. Now, this changed with the start of the Korean War. This is when NATO went from being a piece of paper to an organization. The Korean War, it's often said, put the O for organization into NATO. And it did so in a number of ways. First, it confirmed to hardliners in Washington, who believed that Kim Il-sung's invasion of South Korea in 1950 was instigated at Stalin's direction. It confirmed to these hardliners that Moscow had expansionist aims. Now, historians have since debated the extent to which that's true, the extent to which Stalin signed or ordered the invasion. We know he didn't order it, but he signed off on it. But the point is that it reinforced the hardliner camp in Washington at the time, and it made these more hawkish U.S. policy makers worry about Moscow's intentions in Europe, because if they had moved in the Korean Peninsula to reunify the Korean Peninsula, perhaps Western Europe might be next. And so this developed that camp in Washington into a different model or vision for NATO than that of the 1949 creation model. In other words, NATO added bricks to the vision. It created an integrated command structure. This comes out directly in response to the Korean War. And it's an integrated command structure which makes NATO unlike any other military alliance in history. And Washington at this time also, and this is the Truman administration, Washington also increased the infrastructure and troop contributions to Western Europe, directly again in response to the Korean War. The second theme I want to stress is that U.S. concerns about burden sharing, which you've heard so much about during the Trump years, was there from the very beginning. So when Eisenhower becomes president, he tells his advisors that he doesn't want to see thousands of U.S. boys stationed in Europe in a decade's time. And this is a theme that Kennedy reiterates. He also wanted to draw down the U.S. force presence in Europe. In fact, if you look at the historical record, pretty much every president since NATO's founding has tried, most have failed, to draw down the U.S. force presence in Europe. And they failed because of the conundrum that is inherent in the U.S. commitment. which is that it's easier to put troops into Europe than it is to pull them out. And that's regardless of what the external security situation at the time is like. Because if the US government were to withdraw troops, the perception would always be that it was less serious about its security commitment to the continent, and thereby less serious to deterrence against the Soviet Union and or now Russia. And this is a conundrum, as we'll talk about, I'm sure, that has survived the Cold War into the post-Cold War period and will probably continue to rear its head in the coming months and years as well. The third point I want to make is related, and that it's that efforts at arms control during the later part of the Cold War, the 1970s and 80s, were afflicted with this same disease. On the one hand, Europeans welcomed arms control efforts with Moscow, since they knew that any war, conventional and nuclear, would be fought in their cities and over their heads. But on the other hand, European governments also worried that the more arms limitations that were placed on US forces in Europe, the more vulnerable they would be to Soviet military power or influence. The fourth and final point I want to make about the Cold War period has to do with European experiments to create their own defense community, of which there are several. And again, stressing this theme of continuity, this is a trend which continues in the post-Cold War period, whether it's elements like the CSDP or PESCO or many others, or even strategic autonomy debates today. Now, the US reaction to each of these efforts in the past was mixed, because on the one hand, there was deep skepticism that the Europeans could pull it off. Behind the scenes, there were even, in some administrations at times, outright hostility, because if Europeans managed their own security environment, then Washington would lose its vaulted, preeminent position in Europe. And at the same time, successive US administrations have claimed that this is exactly what they want, a Europe that takes its own security seriously. But as I just noted, at various points during the Cold War, while that was the front page line at the top of the newspaper, privately, US administrations were working to prevent that goal of a Europe that was able to punch more above its weight. All right, with that as background, let's now move on to the main subject of today's talk, the post-Cold War period. Slide, please. So as I mentioned at the outset, I'm going to take these in roughly 5-year intervals or periods, natural periods. The first is 1989 to 1994, which I've titled the "We Won, Now What" period. And the first thing you need to know about these years is that they are dominated by the German question, German reunification. After the Berlin Wall falls in November of '89, the familiar German question rears its head. What do we do about Germany? German reunification at this time is by no means an obvious outcome. Washington has to push hard for this. And it's not just the Soviets and Gorbachev that are worried about a unified Germany and what that could mean for the European security landscape, but it's folks like Prime Minister Thatcher who's worried about the old Germany returning and remilitarizing. Now, there's been a lot of debate among historians and political scientists in recent years, and particularly in recent weeks, given the unfortunate events in Ukraine, over what exactly the US promised Moscow during negotiations over German reunification in 1990. The Kremlin claims that the West promised that NATO would not expand into Eastern Europe, and this is a claim which has been repeated by Putin and Lavrov and other elements of the Putin regime. Now, Washington policymakers who served at the time and since argue that there was no such promise and that the narrative of being wronged is a pretext for Russian adventurism. There's excellent scholarship on this by folks like Josh Shifrinson, who is at Boston University, but moving to the University of Maryland, Mary Surratt, and others. But the question will continue to be debated for years to come. My own view, just quickly, is that the record is clear. Technically, there was no formal promise in the sense that it was not codified or written down, but I think there is compelling evidence to conclude that informal promises were made to Russia that NATO would not expand into former Warsaw Pact countries. Now, I want to be clear, saying that in no way justifies or excuses Russian aggression. So one can believe that informal promises to Gorbachev were made that the US would not push NATO expansion into Eastern Europe, and still believe that Putin and elements of his regime have corrupted that historical narrative and used it to perpetrate horrific crimes, most recently against the Ukrainian people. Those are not irreconcilable positions. The other momentous development that occurs during this period is the search, of course, for NATO's new identity or modus vivendi. What will NATO's purpose be now that the Soviet Union is no more? What do you do if you're a security organization whose primary reason for being is the deterrence and defense of a great power that no longer exists, but is in the midst of economic and social tumult? The problem facing NATO after the end of the Cold War, as then US Senator Richard Lugar famously put it in a speech in 1993, was whether to, quote, go out of area or out of business. Now, ultimately, as we know, NATO decides to go out of area, not out of business. But it goes out of area in two ways, and I think this is often forgotten. Most people are familiar with the decision NATO leaders took at the 1994 summit to expand its borders, to uphold the so-called open door commitment enshrined in the 49 Washington Treaty. But there was another crucial way in which the alliance decides to go out of area during this period, and that is by adopting an entirely new set of missions. It does so, again, because the old mission, that of deterring and possibly having to defend against a Soviet invasion of Western Europe, that threat has seemingly dried up, overnight. Now, there's another motivation for this, and that's coming out of what's happening on the ground in the Balkans in the early and mid-1990s. The violence in the Balkans is also driving this NATO adaptation because, and this is what some people argued at the time, if NATO can't prevent the atrocities and conflict in the Balkans, then what's its purpose? That was an argument that critics argued. And this was very much this adaptation and shift in the identity and purpose of NATO, in addition to the enlargement of NATO, was very much a conscious, deliberate policy choice on the part of Washington to push NATO in these directions. So it enlarges not just in terms of geographic borders, but also missions. And we see this with the 1991 strategic concept, where we see the informal adoption or addition of crisis management. That document refers to the management of crises affecting security of its members, and that emphasis on management of crises or crisis management is reiterated in the 1999 strategic concept, and ultimately see that crisis management is elevated to the level of a core task within NATO, the original core task being, of course, collective defense. But now we have in the late 1990s the addition of crisis management. But it starts again in the 1990s, this idea, this broadening of the purpose of NATO. Slide, please. So then we come to the opening the door moment, as I've called it, the period 1995 to 2001. The Enlargement Study of 1995 is a fascinating document. Those of you interested can access it online. We also see during this period the launch of the Membership Action Plan, or the MAP process. But even before that, we actually in 1999 get the accession of 3 post-Cold War countries, Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland, the Visegrad countries minus Slovakia. And the MAP process, which I just referenced and which has been in the news recently, is actually introduced after that first wave of countries join NATO. And I think it's because participants, both the new countries joining NATO and the old members, recognize that NATO probably could have done more to help that transition. So it institutionalizes the membership process through this membership action plan. Now, another important development during this period is the NATO-Russia Founding Act of 1997, also in the news recently. And I want to pause here and just read the passage that I've taken and highlighted on the slide before you, which is the passage that's gotten a lot of attention in recent years and weeks. And it reads, NATO reiterates that in the current and foreseeable security environment, the alliance will carry out its collective defense and other missions by ensuring the necessary interoperability, integration, and capability for reinforcement rather than by additional permanent stationing of substantial combat forces. And you can tell by the emphasis I placed on those words that what has become a contested debate in recent years is what this passage actually meant, because as usual, participants see different things. If you're in the Moscow camp, if you're in Moscow, you believe that this document, in this document, the alliance agreed not to permanently station forces in former Warsaw Pact countries, the new members of the NATO alliance. But if you're in the NATO and Washington camp, you actually read the text very differently, and you emphasize things like in the current context, right, the foreseeable security environment, and recognize that as that has changed, so may NATO need to change its policy. Now, it's worth noting, and we can talk about this during the Q&A, that there are still technically no permanent NATO forces stationed in Eastern or Central European member states that were former Warsaw Pact countries. All of the troop contributions that have taken place in recent years, like enhanced forward presence, for example, these are all rotational, heel-to-toe, what's called in military jargon, heel-to-toe rotational units, so not permanently stationed. It's anyone's guess as to whether that may be changing. Again, perhaps something we can talk about during the Q&A. Slide, please. So that brings us up to more contemporary times, the turn of the last century, the period 2002 to 2014, the period of Bush II, George Walker Bush, Bush the son, not Bush the daddy, and President Obama. These were the war on terror years, both for U.S. foreign policy writ large and for the NATO-U.S. relationship. Not just Afghanistan, but Iraq. NATO did have a training mission, a police training mission in Iraq. And as I'll mention also, the controversial Bucharest Open Door statement, which again ties into the current crisis. And of course, the period ends in 2014 with the Russian annexation of Crimea. Now on 9/11, you're all probably familiar with then Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld's famous quote that the mission determines the coalition. Privately, Rumsfeld went so far to write on a memo regarding U.S. thinking about NATO or European participation in Afghanistan, a quote, "The last thing we need to see in Kabul is a NATO flag," end quote. Now, I mentioned this, he wrote this in early 2002. The reason I mention this is because that's exactly what we ended up getting, of course. We saw a NATO flag in Kabul. And I'm happy to talk about how that process happened in the Q&A, NATO's role in Afghanistan more broadly, but we've got a very tight schedule, so I'm going to keep on chugging along to the Obama years. I do want to note, though, that this is also when NATO adds a third core task. So we have, during the Cold War period, the core task of collective defense. This is Article 5. What I like to call the Three Musketeers pledge, right? One for all and all for one. But we also saw over the course of the 90s, first the informal and then the formal adoption of crisis management. And now we have the adoption in the 2010 strategic concept of the third and final core task that NATO currently has, which is that of cooperative security. And according to NATO, that consists of components like strengthening partnerships, arms control, non-proliferation, things like that. Now, Obama wants to be a domestic president. He wants to focus on domestic politics when he comes to office. It's worth remembering he's elected during the biggest financial crisis since the Great Depression. But like US presidents before him who have wanted to focus on domestic politics, events have a way of forcing their hand. I also think that he was probably uncomfortable around some foreign policy issues for these reasons. He campaigned on ending the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War. He spent both terms of his presidency trying to extricate the US from Afghanistan, but he didn't succeed. Slide, please. And oh, I should mention that enlargement continues, as we know. 2015 to 2021. This is a period of tremendous adaptation on the part of the alliance. We see the development of things like the enhanced forward presence, the NATO force integration units, or NIFUs, the elevation of the multinational Corps Northeast headquarters in Szczecin, Poland, from low readiness to high readiness, the addition of multinational Division North headquarters, et cetera, et cetera. The US view during this period is a little ambivalent. On the one hand, the Obama administration, as we know, is flirting with this pivot to the Indo-Pacific. It's doing more than flirting. It would really like to pivot, but it keeps having to deal with Europe. It's still trying to get out of Afghanistan as well. The Russians are up to no good. I mentioned annexation of Crimea the year before in 2014. Obviously, we had the war in Georgia in 2008, right? So however much Obama and his administration want to pivot to the Indo-Pacific, they find themselves having to focus on Europe. And one way they do that is by adapting the force structure of the alliance, which really hadn't, the force posture, which hadn't been adapted since the Cold War, to account for the resurging threat from Putin's Russia. And then, of course, Trump enters the scene. He shocks not just, I think, many Americans, but also the world by winning the 2016 presidential election. Now, you may think, aha, surely this is where US policy towards NATO takes a radical departure, right? And that continuity that I've mentioned at the outset of my talk is broken fundamentally. And change happens. Well, not exactly, I would argue. Rhetorically, yes, certainly Trump is explosive and frankly offensive in not just his comments, but also his behavior towards the allies. You may remember, I believe it was in the 2020 summit when he brusquely pushes aside, I think it was the leader of the Republic of Northern Macedonia, the latest member of NATO, in a photo op, right? Because he muscles himself to the front. But putting that image aside and his rhetoric aside, which was, again, inflammatory and offensive, if you look at what his policy actually did, there's a lot of continuity. It increased ERI, European Reassurance Initiative funding. It committed more troops to Poland. It authorized the return of the forward headquarters of the U.S. Army 5th Corps, which hadn't been in Europe since the Cold War and is now in Poland, the forward-based headquarters. So while the image of Trump, right, and Trump's image is certainly controversial for the alliance and marks a break in that sense, behind the scenes, there's a lot of business as usual, I argued at the time and have argued since. Slide, please. And that brings us, hopefully I'm not too much over time, up to contemporary times and the crisis in Ukraine. We also perhaps can talk about China and what NATO's role should or could be in deterring and possibly defending against China's influence in Europe. There are lots of issues I put on the table. I'll leave it there. That's a very quick and dirty of the last 30 or so years of US foreign policy towards NATO. Again, the overriding theme, I would argue, has been of continuity rather than change. Thank you very much.
Sara, thank you so much indeed for that superb overview of the history of NATO, the history of US engagement with the alliance, We're now going to open it up for questions. I've just put a message into the chat box. So for anybody who would like to speak, if you can either just enter a message or enter a question into the chat box or raise your hand, and then I'll take them as they come. In the meantime, if I could just take the liberty of asking the first question.
Good night.
Yes. I mean, sort of, I'm always amazed when I think, when you cover all these different topics, how much of history keeps coming back to haunt us. So you mentioned, for instance, the 97 NATO-Russia Founding Act, and I was intrigued when that came up again in the Russian proposal from December, last December, for the proposed treaty with NATO, saying, those forces that were located in Eastern Europe prior to 97 versus after 97, and on this issue of the permanent basing, I mean, do you think that will actually change come Madrid?
I'm going to say no, because despite the continuity within the alliance, or rather because of the continuity within the alliance, and despite the tremendous adaptation that happened post-2014 Crimea, I think NATO is still fundamentally a cautious, and I would argue rightfully so, alliance. I think that neither Washington nor Brussels or most European capitals have any appetite, frankly, for permanent. The exception being obviously Poland and other Eastern and Central European members of NATO who would like to see and have, you'll recall from the Trump years, the Fort Trump campaign, etc. So with that caveat that yes, those countries on what is sometimes called the eastern flank or the front of the alliance would be open to permanent stationing, I think there is not political will nor frankly the military capability to do so among the Europeans, the Western Europeans. And I think that is true. While the US may have the military capability, I don't think it has the political will, because the Biden administration would very much like to continue the pivot to the Indo-Pacific. They are not using, as far as I know, the language of the Obama administration, the pivot, but that is clearly where the Biden team has its eye on the ball on China. And as I mentioned as well, it's always easier to put troops in and make troop commitments than it is to withdraw or reduce them. So I think political will, military capability, NATO's cautious approach. These are reasons why, if I were a betting person, which I'm not, perhaps I am, I'm not sure, but I would bet against the permanent stationing of forces in the near to foreseeable future.
Yes, I would probably agree. It's unlikely in the foreseeable future, but we'll see.
We'll see.
One thing that you mentioned, which I'm always amazed by, when you reference the pivot, for example, going back to say 2011, and then with Trump closer to 2018, 2019, essentially how all these great strategic moves to Asia always get interrupted, whether by a crisis in the Middle East, a crisis in Europe. How these short-term crises affect this sort of longer-term shift and seem to undermine
domestic internal crises in the U.S., right? The election of Trump, COVID, right? These
likewise,
things.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we have a couple questions. One from David D'Amico. To what extent does NATO stand as a collective interpretation of international anarchy, as claimed by Alexander Wendt? And he says, additionally, can one see Putin's attack on Ukraine as an attempt to draw a line between collectivist interpretations of anarchy and individualistic ones based on sovereignty?
Okay.
Big
wow.
questions.
All of a sudden, I'm back in my IR grad theory seminar in grad school. I am not. I'm not a big fan of labels, but I think that Alex Wendt is right when he says anarchy is what you make of it. However, I think the more overarching theme within NATO, and particularly the U.S. policy towards NATO, is that of great power politics. Frankly, it's Bismarckian, right? Washington's position can be summed up how Bismarck summed up the alliance with between Germany and Austro-Hungary in the pre-World War I period, that within an alliance, there's always a horse and a rider. And I think it's quite clear who the horse is and who the rider is in NATO.
And another question from a fellow Dane, Adam Svensson. Do you see a new Cold War developing today, or how else would you characterize this new era going forward, and where do you see NATO might best figure?
Thank you. Og tak. I could answer in Danish, but I won't. I'll answer in English instead. So on the new Cold War, yes. It's actually, or until recently, it wasn't very popular to use that label, though, for some reason. I mean, generally, again, I'm not a fan of rehashing old labels, old anecdotes, old historical moments, right? We're always hearing a lot from politicians and policymakers referring to things as the next Munich, the Munich moment, right? Like or the next Cuban Missile Crisis. Like we only have these 1 or 2, 3 historical common experiences. But and I mention this only because there was until very recently in the policy community as well as in the academic community a segment that argued quite forcefully, at least on Twitter, all arguments on Twitter are forceful, that it was a mistake to adopt the language of a Cold War with Russia or China, for that matter. Cold War Redux, Cold War 2.0, whatever. I sort of thought that was a silly non-issue, because I think we are, as events have worn out, returning to this more complicated period of relations between Washington and Moscow, and Brussels and Moscow. And it's worth remembering to that extent that the first Cold War had proxy wars, right? It was a Cold War between Moscow and Washington, thankfully, but it was not a period without war. This is something I often tell my students, right? There were lots of wars. The US fought many wars during that period. The Soviet Union participated in many wars during that period. It's just that there was no direct confrontation between those two countries. So I've gone on too long, but yes, I would characterize it. Doesn't mean it's going to be exactly the same, right? History doesn't repeat itself. But I think, if we're grappling for a label to describe the period we're in, a bumper sticker, so to speak, then I'm perfectly comfortable referring to it as a Cold War.
If I could come back briefly to U.S. domestic politics and actually go back to Trump for 1 second first. With Trump making these comments to the effect that potentially the U.S. pulling out of NATO, but never really getting that far. But on the other hand, what you were talking about in terms of actions behind the scenes, that the U.S. Congress was very forceful, trying to push back against that. Behind the scenes, there was, I believe it was called the NATO Support Act or something like this, where
right.
They basically said,
resolution. Yeah, they passed a resolution, right? Yeah. Sorry, I didn't interrupt. Continue.
No. So I'm always just sort of curious in terms of where do you see, not just with that incident specifically, but more generally, I think, looking ahead between, when you see the polarization of U.S. politics with Democrats and Republicans at each other's throats, to what extent is NATO a victim of that battle, or do they actually sort of quietly agree with each other still on that, or is that changing?
So I think it's mixed, and the picture is changing. If you had asked me 2 years ago, as recently as 2 years ago, my answer would have been the following, would have been, look, despite what Trump says, there are several internal checks, mechanisms, to use the social science term, that would prevent that from happening, right? First, there was a debate about what it would even look like for the U.S. to withdraw, given that all of the instruments of ratification of other allies, and indeed any new member that joins NATO, has to send the accession protocols. They're housed in Washington, right, at the State Department, I believe. What it would even look like in terms of international law for the U.S. to withdraw. Second, we had internal checks. Then Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis let it be known that he would resign if Trump moved in that direction. You mentioned the congressional resolution, right? There was enough, I think, support within the Republican Party at that time from folks like Mitt Romney and Lindsey Graham to ensure that wouldn't happen. Now, going forward, you're absolutely right that if anything, U.S. domestic politics are even more polarized today than they were 2 years ago, even though Trump is no longer in office. And I worry about this new breed of Republican politicians, people like Madison Cawthorn. There are a host of them, not worthy of mentioning their names, but for a host of reasons that we don't have time to go into, unfortunately, in domestic politics right now in this country, they are gaining ascendancy within the Republican Party. And so in the near term, I think NATO is still safe, right, from this charge in the Republican movement. But it's worth noting that if you think back to when Biden was first elected, right? Of course, there was a big sigh of relief in many European capitals, but there was also, okay, you know, that's bought us 4 years. We're not worried about Biden. We know Biden. We've had a long working relationship with him, dating back to his years as chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. We're worried about what comes after Biden, right? Precisely because, as you alluded to in your question, of these divisive, polarized trends in U.S. domestic politics. So down the road, you know, I don't study American domestic politics. Perhaps I should study it more, given that I live here. But this rise in the Republican Party of the elements I alluded to, of the Trumpkins, if you will, does pose a challenge for U.S. foreign policy in the world, and that extends to the U.S. Membership and role within NATO historically.
Yes, I mean, when it comes to NATO history, especially going back to the North Atlantic Treaty, to see the role that the Senate actually played on a couple of very key issues. I mean, you know, watering down Article 5 from what the Europeans had wanted at the time. Also, unlike France, which wanted a treaty of 50 years to 100 years, the Senate only wanted about 20 years at most. So it's interesting to see that dynamic. So 2 questions. I'm going to start with David's, both of which are about essentially non-events. Sort of explain non-events. So he asks, given the rhetoric in Russia today that you see about backing this operation in Ukraine against the West, against Western encroachment, how to explain Russia's non-reaction to the Baltic enlargement?
I don't think Russia non-reacted to the Baltic enlargement. I think it happened during a period where both they and the rest of the world were distracted and had other issues, right? And also that Putin's Russia didn't think it was strong enough. Now, I'm not a Putinologist. I have friends that are, though, and I read some of their work, but there is an argument within that branch of academia and scholarship about what was the red line for Putin, so to speak. When did NATO and Washington go too far, right? And there are those that argue that no, it wasn't NATO enlargement, it's about the EU. There are others that argue no, it's about actually the Balkans, not the Baltics, and NATO's intervention that I mentioned in the 1990s there. But I think, just to answer your question more succinctly, I think that in the early 2000s, Washington, the Bush administration is preoccupied with Iraq and Afghanistan, the war on terror, and they're preoccupied with transatlantic relations to the extent that, as we all know, there was a fallout over the Iraq war, and the Baltic states very famously supported and contributed to both the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts, and the Bush administration wants to support that. There's also an ideological element to the Bush administration. He is a firm believer of the democratic peace thesis, to bring in IR grad theory again. And so he and the Bush administration is very welcoming of bringing in the Baltics. But from Putin and Moscow's point of view, remember that at the early 2000s, Putin is reaching out to Washington, right? He is one of the first leaders to call Bush and say, yes, we have to confront international jihadism together, right? Because of Chechnya and other issues. So Putin isn't entirely turned off against the West and NATO at this point. It's a gradual process and evolution, I would argue, is what leads to this rift. And I think the view among the Putinologists that I'm personally most convinced of is that it is the color revolutions and the Maidan movement in Ukraine that is that, the final red line for him. Putin, for whatever reason, is convinced of this conspiracy theory that Hillary Clinton was trying to overthrow him. And so for him, that marked the real juncture, I think.
Another question, again, sort of a non-event. When we think about what happened recently with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, or next invasion of Ukraine, however you want to define it, but basically whether it's characterized in a sense as a failure of deterrence. Now, I know there are questions about deterrence of a direct attack, but also some sort of extended deterrence, at least in terms of a lot of the statements that were made and actions that were taken, threats that were made about, if you do this, we'll do that, and so on. In your opinion, do you think that there was anything more that NATO could or should have done prior to the 24th of February that it did not do?
No, and frankly, that's an argument, the idea that NATO deterrence failed because Russia invaded Ukraine for a second time in February of this year, is an argument that doesn't hold water, and one I don't understand. Ukraine is not a member of NATO, right? That to an extent is at the crux of this current crisis. And NATO deterrence only applies to NATO members. So I know that I've seen that argument out there. The logic of it, I just don't find compelling. And to answer your second question more directly, again, no, I think NATO not only did what it could in the run-up to the Russian invasion in February, but today is doing what it can. I'm often asked by media, what more can NATO do? And a couple of weeks ago, the media was all abuzz about a no-fly zone, which President Zelensky has asked for repeatedly, and the Polish MiG offer, and all of that was in the news. And I was publicly on the record at the time and since that I thought that was a bridge too far, and that's an argument I continue to make. So I think NATO has probably gone as far as it can go. Humanitarian aid, military aid by individual NATO allies, but no NATO forces in Ukrainian airspace or territory.
And we just had a question from Elena asking, to what extent can the current conflict in Ukraine affect Georgia-NATO relations in the future?
Well, I'm not an expert on NATO-Georgian relations, but off the top of my head, I would say it's going to affect Georgia and other NATO aspirant countries, right? I referenced very quickly, though I didn't go into details, the Bucharest Statement from 2008, which reiterated NATO's open door policy to countries like Georgia and Ukraine. And I think for the foreseeable future, we're not going to see any new European states join NATO. And that extends to Finland. I just did an interview with a British radio station yesterday because there's a lot of chatter now about Finland, which is another NATO partner, or Sweden potentially joining NATO. The Finnish government is due to release a white paper, I believe, later this month, where they make their recommendation, and there's been some media buzz that they could actually request an invitation to join NATO in time for the June summit. I'm skeptical of that for a number of reasons, having to do with many of the same reasons I alluded to about the permanent stationing of forces in Eastern Europe, the lack of political will, right? Finland has the longest border of any European country with Russia, 1,300 kilometers or so, I think, right? That's a border that NATO would be signing up to defend. I don't see political will or, frankly, European military capability to do that right now. Publicly, of course, NATO has to, Brussels headquarters, Stoltenberg, have to continue, and the NATO allies themselves, the capitals, have to continue to reiterate this message of the open door policy. That's outward facing. But privately, behind doors, I suspect there would be a lot of members who would be uncomfortable with taking any more collective defense guarantee obligations right now.
Yes, I think that's one of the most interesting things about the Finnish question specifically. On the one hand, do the Finns actually want to go for it finally or not? But on the other hand, is NATO ready to receive them? And sort of, and that leads me to sort of this question about intra-alliance arguments amongst alliance members. I mean, this is why I was always curious about the prospect of Ukrainian or much less Georgian membership, in terms of, would you have actually gotten 30 members to agree to that in the first place? That seemed highly unlikely, to put it politely. I was thinking virtually impossible. Finland probably slightly more possible, but as you say, it's an enormous commitment. And with will Hungary, for example, for instance, support that? What other countries would actually go ahead with that? Would Washington even want that now or not? So, yeah. One would think that it would be a very, very contentious issue, to say the least.
I would agree again. This may be boring for your students, but I would agree exactly. And just to go back to the Finnish point, you mentioned domestically whether the question mark over whether the Finnish government and Finnish public polls notwithstanding, I think there was just a public poll, the Financial Times said, showing 60 some odd % support for the first time for Finland potentially joining NATO. But I mentioned a moment ago why I think supply side, right? If we think about alliances as demand and supply relationships, why supply side within NATO, there was going to be little appetite, I thought, for Finland or any other new European state joining NATO. But demand side, in the Finnish case, I actually suspect, and you can quote me on this since it's recorded, I think what the Finnish government, and again, I'm not an expert of Finnish politics by any means, but the strategist in me suspects that, or rather, if I were a Finnish politician, what the Finns are probably doing is trying to use this public discussion of possible NATO membership to curry leverage. Leverage not just in an attempt to signal to Moscow, hey, don't get any ideas, we have options available to us, right? But also leverage, because at the end of the day, and this goes back to the theme of the talk today, right? And Bismarck's quote from a couple of minutes ago about the horse and the rider. At the end of the day, what most countries in the world still want, even though we're exiting the unipolar moment, is they want the U.S. In their corner. They want to know that the U.S. military, when push comes to shove, will have their back. So I wouldn't be surprised if what we will end up with is some sort of new defense agreement, not necessarily a collective defense, because that would obligate the U.S. To Finland's defense, but a new defense agreement between Washington and Helsinki, stronger defense cooperation, not just with NATO, but more importantly, I think, with Washington. So I wanted to put that on the table. But regarding your comment about intra-alliance arguments among allies, yes, first of all, that's not new, right? They've been there from the beginning, from the founding, going back to the vision of what NATO should be. Certainly they were there in the immediate post-Cold War era. They're there now, right? The interesting thing, though, is that since NATO is an alliance that operates by consensus and unanimity, right? And because of the collective action problem, this is a great primer for grad school. Because of the collective action problem, and because NATO's membership has grown from 12 to 30 and potentially more in the future, right? Each new addition, since we're talking about membership issues, but it applies to a host of issues, including NATO's future role and missions, becomes harder to achieve consensus on, because there's one more voice around the table yammering for its voice to be heard, right, with a different point of view. And it's not just Hungary, and it's not just Turkey, and it's not just Greece, right, and it's not just the East-South split that we used to talk about after the Crimea annexation. with Ukraine, you mentioned, right, and going back to Bucharest, it was well known that the Bush administration was pushing and was supportive for the same reasons I mentioned earlier, that they supported the Baltic accession of states to NATO. They wanted Ukraine and Georgia to join or be invited to begin the process. It was countries like Germany and France, right, and others who were saying, whoa, we're not ready for this, right? So that's more of that continuity. And again, the more NATO expands, enlargement in membership and missions, the harder it will become to get consensus because there are more bodies in the room.
Yes, we've had a follow-up question which goes more specifically to, and you might have answered it to a large extent already, about economic sanctions and the different attitudes among NATO members towards that, and will that affect the collective action decisions inside NATO? But before actually sort of just follow on from that, actually, I mean, there was an interesting article that I read the other day about intelligence sharing within the alliance prior to the Russian invasion on 24 February, basically saying that on the one hand you had the US and the UK who had one point of view, the French and the Germans were sort of holding the alliance back from taking certain actions. It wasn't even Hungary or Turkey, supposedly, at least according to this article, because they had their assessments of the situation were more optimistic. They didn't think that Russia would actually invade, and they thought that taking any actions at that point would have been premature. So I'm sort of just curious in terms of sort of looking forward, perhaps all the more so now with the Hungarian election over and done with, whether you're likely to see more divisions within the alliance emerge.
Certainly the same divisions that we've come to know. I won't say know and love, but come to know and expect, right? And I don't think I saw the article that you're referencing, but I did hear that the French intelligence chief, if I'm not mistaken, retired because the French intelligence services got it wrong, as you just mentioned. Regarding internal intelligence sharing within the alliance, that's always been difficult. I know I always ask when I speak to NATO military officials about that, right? And I remember one U.S. officer telling me, look, yes, there's the problem of overclassification in NATO. That's a problem within the U.S. military as well. And that makes it really hard. And the example he gave me, I'll never forget, was that he had just gotten from the Pentagon a weather report warning that there were a lot of ticks where he was stationed. This was during a tour of some of the Baltic states and NATO installations there I made in the summer of 2017, right? And so he was saying, look, I just received, for example, he was trying to make the point about the ridiculousness of some of the obstacles to intelligence sharing within or among NATO allies. He said, I just received a warning from the Pentagon about, it's tick season here, and I need to take precautions. And I can't, that's classified at a level where I can't share that with the NATO officer sitting next to me, right? I also remember, the old joke in Washington that you can pick up the front page of the Washington Post and New York Times and read stories there that are classified or rather included in classified briefings, right? So there is a problem of overclassification in NATO. There's a problem of intelligence sharing. Having said that, with respect to the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February, the surprising thing to me on intelligence issues was how outwardly sharing and facing the Biden administration was. I recall at the time I thought, wow, they are really going out on a limb here with the statements they're making, that Blinken and not just his UN presentation, right, but to have the Secretary of State and other high-ranking levels and including up to the level of the president go on the record in mid-February, this is before the invasion, saying, look, we have this intelligence, right? You're putting yourself, especially given what everyone was thinking about at the time, 2003, and the failure of U.S. intelligence over the Iraq WMD programs, right? The Biden administration, I thought, was, whoa, they are really putting themselves out on a limb here. And there have been since then, explainer pieces saying, look, this was a deliberate choice on the part of the Biden administration, which I think is obviously right, to try to not only rally allies and, which they were doing privately, but also publicly, the domestic audiences in allied countries, and say, look, this is real, but also perhaps an attempt to both deter Putin and say, look, we understand what's going on. We have insight and we have sources and methods that are very advanced. So if you choose to go ahead with this, like, you don't know where we are and when we'll be listening and what we have access to. So I think the decision that the Biden administration took to be so public and outwardly facing and so certain with their intelligence had served multiple strategic purposes. On economic sanctions, not a sanctions scholar, but I remember from my grad school days, economic sanctions don't work. They are very popular, however, in democracies because the publics demand their representatives do something, right? And certainly after what's transpired in Ukraine over the past month, and certainly within the last couple of days, the images that are horrific and coming out and the stories coming out, that clamor for our governments to do something are justified. I share them. But on the other hand, the scholar in me, the academic in me, recognizes that when it comes to policy tools available to the US and other NATO countries, they are restricted. And yes, the sanctions lever is an easy one for countries to pull, but at the end of the day, they don't work. If by work we mean compelling Putin's government to halting its crimes in Ukraine, or the Russian people to overthrow him. Right? There's a debate about whether the sanctions are targeted at because they're a range of sanctions at this point, right? Some are targeted directly at the oligarchs and Putin's supporters to make them pressure him into withdrawing from Ukraine, ceasing his crimes there, and or to remove him, or whether they're directed at the Russian people to make their lives so miserable, right, that they stage a regime change themselves. So there's, again, a debate within sanctions about where they're targeted and what the ultimate purpose is in this case, but I don't think they're going to work.
Sara, thank you so much. As you're making that, referring to that joke about intelligence sharing, I mean, I think the other joke, of course, is that the NATO official gives the US official some classified information, and then the US reclassifies it and then can't give it back to the NATO official afterwards. That kind of phenomena, which tends to be quite common as well, I gather. Right. Well, look, as it's just several minutes past 6 p.m., I'm afraid I will need to bring this session to a close. Sara, thank you so much for a superb presentation, which I found extremely informative, and I'm certain you've definitely given all of us a lot to take away from your talk and to think about. Before leaving, however, I would like to inform all of you that the next session in this series will take place on the 28th of April. Dr. Andrew Payne of the University of Oxford will be giving a talk entitled All About Politics, How the American Electoral Cycle Shapes Wartime Decision-Making. We'll also be returning to the NATO theme with an in-person lecture by Professor Bruce Gentleson of Duke University on the 9th of May here at eBay. So I look forward to seeing you at the end of April and wishing all of you a very pleasant remainder of the day. Thanks, and thanks so much, Sara.
Thank you so much. It was a lot of fun. Take care, everyone.